Hello, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. My name is Rebecca Lammers. I am the chair of the Democrats Abroad Taxation Task Force. It's my pleasure to be presenting How to Survive Tax Day as an American Abroad for 2026. Before we get into everything, please be sure to submit the feedback form. Your feedback on what you thought of this webinar is really critical in order to help us improve our tax webinars that we present. So please be sure to fill this out after the webinar or after you watch the recording. And unfortunately, I have to read our disclaimer to make sure that everybody understands everything. So I'll read this and then we'll get into it. So, Democrats abroad cannot provide individual tax advice. Advice requires consideration of your individual circumstances and needs, none of which can be done at this event. We are not tax lawyers, accountants, or advisors. Please consult a professional tax advisor, accountant, return preparer when addressing your personal tax matters. Democrats Abroad does not endorse or recommend companies or individuals attending or hosting this event. If you are in need of tax advice, you can consult the IRS Tax Return Preparer directory to find an advisor or tax return preparer near you or providing online services to meet your needs and budget. Democrats Abroad accepts no liability for any actions taken or not taken by participants in this event as a result of information obtained at this event or from a participant choosing a preparer either from the IRS directory or based on something someone said or did at this event. Okay, so we have the formalities out of the way. So here's the agenda. We've gotten the housekeeping and intros out. I'm going to be doing the main presentation, and then I'll then talk through a little bit more about Democrats Abroad and the work that we do as an organization, and then we will finish off with the live Q&A. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So a little bit about me. I'm not an accountant. I do not have any tax qualifications. I am like many of you. I got angry about the tax situation for Americans abroad and I wanted to do something about it. So that's why I'm a volunteer for Democrats Abroad. Whether or not you realize this, there is only one paid employee as it currently stands for Democrats Abroad. Everybody else is a volunteer. So, a little bit about me. I'm originally from Ohio and I moved to London to do my master's 18 years ago. And basically, what happened was I studied, I then got a job here, I then met my British husband, and so life kept me here. As is, I think, a lot of people have either moved abroad for work or a non-US spouse or to study. I think I tick a lot of those boxes. But I had always filed using TurboTax since I moved abroad up until 2014, which was when I started my own business and it dawned on me that I might not be filing my US taxes right. I had always been on the Democrats Abroad mailing list and I voted every 4 years, but I wasn't particularly interested or active politically in any way. I was surprised when I started going to Democrats Abroad events in 2017 that there wasn't more action going on to address the tax problems for Americans abroad. And that's what I thought Democrats Abroad did. But I eventually started volunteering by hosting tax education events in London and helping out with the Democrats Abroad Global Taxation Task Force, which is the group of volunteers within Democrats Abroad dedicated to tax advocacy, the group that I now lead. And we'll talk more about that later. So, 4 years ago, I was appointed to become the chair of the Taxation Task Force. And then that same year, I was also offered the role of the international member of the Taxpayer Advocacy Panel, which is a federal advisory committee of the IRS. And I'll tell you more about that one later too. But the last few years, I've learned a lot about filing taxes, where the systemic issues are, why it's so hard to file from abroad, and why do we have to file in the first place. So, this webinar is basically the culmination of what I've learned over the last few years so that you don't have to go through the same problems or make the same mistakes, which cost me a lot of money and time. And you may have seen some of the other tax webinars that we've hosted, but that you can think of this one as like the prerequisite to filing taxes from abroad. So we're going to go through the basics, starting with the who, what, where, when, and why. So all U.S. citizens, who has to file basically? All U.S. citizens. That is the straightforward answer. Regardless of where we live in the world, how long we've lived outside the US, and even if they are a US citizen but they've never lived on US soil, we are all subject to US tax. It doesn't matter how old you are. Some babies even have to file a tax return, or obviously their parents have to file a return for them. Or if you're retired and no longer working, sometimes, even if your income is only $5, that triggers a filing requirement of a US tax return. But don't worry, I'm going to outline many of the rules here in a minute. But I wanted to point out here that it actually says in our US passports, I'm just going to quote this. It says, all US citizens working and residing abroad are required to file and report on their worldwide income. Consult IRS Publication 54, which is the tax guide for US citizens and resident aliens abroad. This is like the IRS's quintessential guide to filing from abroad. Um, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. The guide is 40 pages. It's not a light read, but I'm going to highlight this one section from the guide since it's really important. It says, if you are a US citizen or resident alien, your worldwide income is generally subject to US income tax, regardless of where you're living. Also, you are subject to the same income tax requirements that apply to US citizens or resident aliens living in the United States. So I'm not saying this to scare you. I'm just saying this to point out that there is information that is very readily available in our US passport that very clearly outlines that we are subject to US tax as US citizens. So, yes, this applies to you regardless of how you identify. So, whether you identify as a US citizen, an American abroad, a dual citizen, an American expat, an American overseas, or even an accidental American. And yes, this still applies to you even if you don't have a US passport or a US Social Security number. Um, and there's one thing I want to clarify because this is often a contentious issue. But we met with the US State Department Citizen Services when we were in Washington, D.C. This was over a year ago. And they clarified to us that if you are born abroad with a US citizen parent and they didn't register your birth abroad with your local US embassy, and you haven't filed the paperwork with your local embassy to obtain US citizenship, you are not actually a US citizen. There's a lot of confusion and misinformation about transmission of birthright citizenship, and the legalese on the official government's website is so confusing. Even I misunderstood it for a very long time. So, clarification of US citizenship and therefore tax liability comes up a lot in these tax discussions, especially for people who are born abroad. I know there are a number of people on this webinar that likely have children that were born abroad. But the best way to figure out if you're unsure, if your children born abroad have US citizenship, is to actually contact your local US embassy. So, the number one tip that I have for you today to surviving tax day is this. Assume you need to file a US tax return unless proven otherwise. So many people mistakenly think they don't need to file or have received wrong or bad information on the internet from accountants. And I've even heard stories of people talking to the embassy saying, oh, you don't need to file. It's crazy how bad misinformation is about who needs to file a US tax return as a US citizen living abroad. But this is one of the best ways to approach this to cover yourself. So, how do you figure out if you do need to file? Um, Now, coming at this from a position of everyone needs to file, here are some tips on how to figure out if you don't have to file. And one of the best ways to do this is to actually use the Do I Need to File a Tax Return tool on the IRS website. And I think the link is in the chat box. I can't see the chat box, but it should go in there. And it will ask you just a few basic questions like what tax year you're filing for, what your filing status is. And even if you're not sure about that, there's another tool called What is My Filing Status tool on the IRS website. It'll ask you about your income and things like that. It's not just US sourced income. You are liable for tax on your worldwide income, which includes income that you earned anywhere in the world, including your country of residence. It's everything, all of your income. That's what gross income is. So everything gets reported, or assume that you need to report it unless you find otherwise. Not just if you're employed, but if you're retired and you're getting payments from your retirement plan or pension too, everything gets reported. So if you use the tool and it says that you don't have to file, great, you don't have to file. But most people do find that they do need to file. And that is really the majority of Americans abroad that are earning some kind of an income. So there might be some reasons, even if you don't have to file, that you might find it advantageous to file anyway. So here are a few different reasons. So for example, if you need to obtain a green card for your non-US spouse, so you may be planning to move to the United States and you need to provide the last few years of tax returns to prove income in support of the green card for your non-US spouse. If you're moving to the United States and, for example, you're wanting to buy a house there and you want to get a mortgage, then they would ask you for proof of income, which is typically done through sharing a copy of your tax return. A lot of people, including myself, were motivated to reduce your US federal student loan payments. This was my main motivation for many years to file, since I was able to reduce my federal student loan payments based on my income that was reported on my tax return. And finally, you may want to file to prevent identity theft. Some people file just to prevent anyone else from using their taxes for fraud to claim false refunds. So it's worth considering this one, especially if you're retired, because it is common for people, fraudsters, to file a tax return, especially if you may not even know that that's happening. So something to bear in mind. Many parents file to obtain the refundable child tax credit. And this is this is a main motivation for a lot of parents. Um, for 2025, you can get up to $2,200 per child. And if you've not been filing, you can file the last 3 years of returns to back claim previous years of child tax credits. This is real. I've I've heard from people who were like, "Is this real?" They didn't believe me. It is real. You file your return, you get the cash. And in order to claim it, you have to file a tax return. Each child needs to have a social security number, should not be claimed on another tax return, so there's no double dipping. And if for example, the child was born last year, then you can claim them for the child tax credit this year. And we're actually hosting a webinar that will go into a lot more detail about this in 2 weeks' time on Wednesday, January 28th. And that webinar is free to attend. So if you'd like to sign up, the URL for the webinar should be in the chat box now. But it's specifically on clarifying birthright citizenship and the child tax credit for American families abroad. We have an accountant that's going to be joining us, as well as an immigration lawyer who will be able to explain how all of that works. Okay, so tip number 2 to surviving tax day: don't assume you'll have to pay US tax. A lot of people think that because they have to file a US tax return, that they'll owe something. But statistically speaking, Most people living abroad don't owe any US tax. We actually, because we pay tax in our country of residence, right? On average, 60% of people filing from abroad owe no US tax. And this is because we're liable and pay tax in our country of residence first, and then we file a US tax return to prove that we already paid tax where we live and we don't owe any US tax. I know it's really stupid, but that's how it works. You have to file to prove that you owe no US tax. So, when you file your US tax return, everyone files what's called Form 1040. Think of the 1040 as the cover letter for your tax return. It's only 2 pages and there are a lot of lines, but it basically acts as a summary of your tax return. And many people have additional forms that are included with this form, but this is the basis of the US tax return that you file with the IRS. And here's a table of some of the most common forms that Americans abroad use. And you'll see listed here the IRS average estimate for time to complete each form. It is shocking that they estimate people will take 50 plus hours for one form. That's in addition to all the other forms. It's just crazy. So, filing deadlines. So, April 15th is traditionally known as tax day in the United States. I think anybody who's lived in the US for a long time or previously lived in the US, they have this date, April 15th, like ingrained in their minds as the deadline, which is great. But April 15th is the deadline if you live in the US. For Americans abroad, the deadline is June 15th. So we get an extra 2 months to file. I don't actually know why Americans abroad have 2 extra months. Maybe because back before e-filing, they needed the extra time to mail the paper returns from abroad back to the United States. But the deadline remains in place. And I mean, I'm not going to complain about having more time, right? But keep in mind that you still have to file any tax that is owed by April 15th. So if you think you might owe anything, but don't have your return ready to submit yet, you can make an estimated payment anytime between when tax filing season opens, which the IRS just announced at the end of last week that it will be opening on January 28th. Sorry, January 26th, Monday, January 26th this month, up to April 15th. And as long as you make an estimated payment, if you think you owe, you won't accrue any interest or penalties. It's generally recommended that if you think you'll owe something, but you're not sure how much, it's better to overpay than underpay, so you'd get a refund of the balance rather than owe any interest. So another caveat, be careful. Some of the common forms for Americans abroad, like 3520A, which is a foreign trust reporting form, those have a deadline filing a filing deadline of March 15th, and penalties can accrue if it's not filed on time. But you can always file an extension to October 15th, and anybody can do this if and it's really super easy. If you need more time beyond the June 15th deadline to get an extension, you file what's called Form 4868, and most of the online tax prep software allows you to file it for free. For example, one time I was in the US around the time of the deadline, and I literally just printed it off and mailed it to the IRS, and that was it. And in very extreme cases, you can also do an additional extension request to December 15th. So there are definitely options to give you more time if you need it. So tip number 3 to surviving tax day, filing sooner is always better than later. I know a lot of countries don't align with the US tax filing deadlines, and so it makes sense to take advantage of the June or the October filing deadlines. But if you can file by April every year, it's worth doing that just so that you can get it, have the peace of mind, get it off of your plate so you're not thinking about it anymore, and you can just move on and enjoy the rest of your life at least for the rest of the year. Um, so don't procrastinate. It really does fester in people's minds, and I think it's difficult for people to have that on weight on their shoulders. So just get it out of the way so that you can move on with your life. So this is a question we get a lot of the time. Why is it so difficult filing from abroad? And this is a really good question. And why does it all seem so backwards the way the US taxes Americans abroad? Well, the US is unique in terms of taxing its citizens, regardless of where we live in the world. It has what's called a citizenship-based tax system, whereas the rest of the world has a residence-based tax system. And most people in the world are taxed only where they live. And that makes sense, right? So the US is out of step with the rest of the world. And so this is what causes a lot of the problems Americans abroad face with having to deal with two different tax systems. The tax system for our country of residence, as well as continuing to need to file and be liable for tax in the US because of our US citizenship. We also suffer from an outdated stereotype that all Americans abroad are rich. We know that isn't true. Americans abroad have a similar income distribution to stateside citizens, but Congress often doesn't know that. And when they do think about us, they well, A, they often don't think about us because they don't hear from us. Um, and then, secondly, when they do think about us, they think that we're all rich, which is why there are so many overly complicated international information reporting forms with our US tax return and why our returns are so long, even though we don't owe any US tax. But for the most part, when Congress passes laws, they just don't think about us. So there are a bunch of things that we have to deal with since it's basically a bunch of unintended consequences that jumble together and make things even more complicated. But the good news is that with the advocacy work within Democrats abroad over the last few years, this perception has changed a lot. We now go to Washington, D.C., we meet with congressional leaders. They've met with us before. They understand who we are much better than they have ever before. So it's all heading in the right direction, basically. So, tip number four. This next tip is a pretty easy concept that is hard to follow. Learn and address your concerns rather than ignore them. So many people I've talked to over the years about these tax problems have let it sit and they know they're supposed to be filing and they don't do anything for years. And once they finally do get the courage to face it and try to address the tax issues, they often will get hit with penalties or a big tax bill. And I don't want this to happen to anybody. And I'm not saying this to scare anybody either, but it's much better for you to address it sooner rather than later, um, so that it doesn't become a bigger problem. But all of you are here on this webinar, which is a really great first step. And I think that you all know that you can't be an ostrich sticking your head in the ground anymore. You really do need to do something. And the reason that we run these tax webinars is because, it's much better to get some education and know how to deal with this stuff than to continue to let it manifest into a big ball of fear that for many, a lot of people, it can take over your lives. But education here is really key. To put it another way, I'd rather you see the bus coming so that you can step out of the way than to get hit by the bus. So, we're going to talk about how to be a smart taxpayer. Um, and there's lots of different ways to do this. So, a lot of people don't know that there is a taxpayer bill of rights. And this is really like you have rights as a taxpayer, as a US citizen taxpayer. So I'll just briefly read through that there's 10 of them. There's the right to be informed, the right to quality service, the right to pay no more than the correct amount of tax, the right to challenge the IRS's position and be heard, the right to appeal an IRS decision in an independent forum, the right to finality, the right to privacy, the right to confidentiality, the right to retain representation, and the right to a fair and just tax system. Whenever you call the IRS or if you interact with the IRS and you feel like you're not being treated fairly, you can remind them, as part of the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, I have a right to, like, if they've been dragging something on for years, you have a right to finality. You have a right to close your case and move on with your life. And you can remind them anytime you talk to anybody about it. It's really, really important that you know that you have these rights. And with the legal rights, this is another area which I think a lot of people don't realize is, and I'm just going to quote from this article here. Um, oh no, sorry, this is from a court case, and there's a link to the article here. Basically, a taxpayer has the legal right to decrease the amount of what otherwise would be his taxes or to avoid them altogether by means which the law permits. So, AKA, it's legal to find ways to reduce or eliminate your taxes. Secondly, this is another key thing I don't think a lot of people realize is you personally have your name on the tax return. You are responsible for its accuracy, even if you pay someone else to prepare it for you. A lot of people will outsource filing the tax return to someone else, thinking that they know better, they're an expert, etc. And if the IRS comes knocking, then they're covered like an insurance policy because they paid an expert to do it for them, right? No, that's if you sign a contract with a tax preparer or you look at the terms and conditions in terms of hiring them, it is very rare for an accountant to take on the responsibility if the IRS comes back and says, actually, we audited your tax return or we found an error and you actually owe more tax or you owe a penalty or something like that. So you are the one that is responsible. You're the one signing your own tax return, even if you pay somebody else to prepare it for you. So don't treat an accountant like an insurance policy. Okay, another thing is when it comes to communicating with the IRS, it's really important for you to know that the IRS will never email you. They will never contact you on social media. They will never send you a text message. They do not communicate in that way. You can contact the IRS by calling them on the phone, by fax. Yes, I know the US government still does fax, or by post, so by mailing a letter in. The IRS will contact you by phone, so they may try to call you, by fax, which I don't know why they still use fax, but anyway, fax, or by post. Often they will send multiple letters about the same issue if they're trying to contact you by mail. And also, since a few years ago, there is paperless correspondence available through the online IRS account. So I wanted to tell you more about the online IRS account if you haven't heard about it yet already. So just a few years ago, the IRS set it up so that not only can Americans abroad have an online IRS account, but you can register with a non-US address and a non-US phone number. Woo! Only took until I think it was 2022 that it started. So it's crazy. It's taken them that long, but you can set up an online IRS account. It's pretty straightforward. That said, we do get complaints. We do hear from people who still struggle, in particular with verifying their identity. We actually hosted a webinar with ID Me, which is the third party that has been commissioned by the government in order to set up and verify identity for Americans abroad. So you can watch that webinar from it was a few years ago now, but it's still very relevant. And also, once you set up your ID.me account through the IRS, it will also allow you to access your online Social Security account as well. So there's a double benefit to doing that. And I would really recommend that you do this because at least you have the visibility of what the IRS has on you. It's a really, really useful tool to have. Okay, e-filing. I really am a strong proponent of e-filing, so it just means submitting your return to the IRS online. I hear from a number of people, and our most recent survey actually showed that 30% of people who live abroad still paper file, which is kind of crazy. There's this myth that if you have a non-US spouse that you can't e-file. It's actually the tax software that's unable to support it. There are a number of online tax prep software that does accommodate e-filing with a non-US spouse. So I'll talk a little bit more about those shortly here. Um, and also, you can use a tax software or tax return preparer that will e-file too. Only really super complex cases need to be paper filed, and there are certain limited forms which are not e-filable, unfortunately. But once you've filed, you can then check your online IRS account to see when your return has been processed. They always process much faster compared to a paper return, and you won't get, whereas when you e-file, you do get some sort of confirmation that your return has been received. Whereas if you paper file, you won't get any kind of confirmation from the IRS after you file unless you have an online account and you go and you check it. But the IRS is like months behind, even now, processing paper returns. They process the e-filed returns much, much faster. So save yourself the stress and oh yeah, and no news equals good news a lot of the time with the IRS as well. So e-file to save yourself on the stress. Okay, so free resources. This is my favorite one. So a lot of people can't figure out how to file for free. I'm going to tell you how. So free file program. So there are about eight different sorry, there's nine different free file participants. So basically this is a government run initiative in order to encourage people, low income individuals in particular, to file their tax return online for free. The government does an abysmal job of promoting the free file program. And then on top of that, they also of the different third-party tax online tax prep software programs, a lot of them are very unfriendly for Americans abroad. Um, that said, a lot of them do work. I talk to people all the time who have found a way to use like OLT or Tax Act or Tax Slayer, and it works. They've just figured it out. Um, in order to qualify for the free file program, you need to have an adjusted gross income of under 89,000 US dollars, or the equivalent of whatever, based on whatever currency that you would have been earning in. Um, if you don't qualify for the free file program, though, there are still options available. So one of them is free file fillable forms, which is basically like it's like the superest basic of online tax prep. It's not even like a software. It's literally like you filling out the form, but online. There's some issues with free file fillable forms though, like uh, it is geo-blocked in certain countries for some reason, and also they have issues with accepting non-US addresses. But I know people who use it and they're happy with it. Just bear in mind if you do go down that route, it does not say it does you set up an account and then by the end of the year the account is totally wiped. So anything you use or create through free file fillable forms, you need to save locally on your computer. It's not going to save it in the software online for you. I also hear a lot of people successfully using OLT.com. And all of the free file programs are available as a paid version, ranging anywhere from about 20 to $50 ish. If your income is over the 89,000 US dollar income threshold. So there are options. It's not ideal to have to pay to file, but I think the main thing to keep in mind, though, is that these free file programs aren't built with expats in mind, but they can do the job if you know what forms you need, especially. And a lot of them are like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole, unfortunately. But you can make them work. So I actually wrote a blog post, and sorry, I haven't written an updated one yet for this year yet. But there's the link where I went through and I reviewed all of the different free file providers. So which ones accept non-US addresses, which ones accept non-US phone numbers, which ones will allow you to e-file for married filing separately with a non-US spouse. All of those kind of things are reviewed so that you can go through, look at which one might work best for your situation, and then try it out. Ooh. Okay, so this is what I'm really excited to get to and to announce on this webinar. So last year, um, and this was through lots of networking and connections and everything. Cornell University runs a free taxpayer help service that is actually funded by the US government. And also they have partial private funding as well. But because Cornell University is Ivy League, you have lots of students who like to be challenged, and unfortunately, filing a tax return from abroad is challenging. And so I reached out and I said, "Hey, is there any scope in order for you guys to take on what is referred to in the tax world as international taxpayers?" And they said yes. And so last year they ran a pilot. They helped out a lot of people. And I wasn't able to scream and shout about it as much as I would have liked. But I'm really excited that they have more capacity this year. So if you are low income, disabled, or speak English as a second language, you are eligible to use their free international taxpayer help service. And there's some caveats though. So it is only going to be available until April 15th. And that's because all of the tax returns are supervised by experienced, well, they're all prepared by the students. They're law students, they are business students, and they are students that are studying to become CPAs and tax preparers and such as well. So it's a whole kind of range of students, undergraduate and master's level. But they are supervised by highly qualified and world-leading experienced tax and law professors. So you know that your return is you're getting help from experienced people. There are two options. There's the majority of the help that they provide is through the self-preparation with coaching. So essentially, they provide Zoom drop-in sessions where you can just join and say, "Hey, I'm using OLT to file my tax return, but I got this screen and it says I need to fill in this, but I don't know what that is. Can you help me?" They can help you. They will hold your hand through helping you self-prepare and submit your tax return. To qualify, you need to have an income under the 89,000 US dollar threshold. And then the second option, which is, I really need to stress this, severely limited. They only took on two people last year for this. They have more capacity this year, but it depends on how complex the cases are. So this is where Cornell will prepare the tax return for you. And this one has a lower income threshold of about $86,000. So those are the options. The link to their website is there. I also wrote another blog post talking more about and providing more background in terms of what the service offers. But they will, I would recommend that maybe like in a week, like from January 26th, check the website, the cornellfreetax.org website. It will have the times where you can join the Zoom drop-in sessions, and also more information about getting help from them. So I really hope that that is helpful for people. The other thing that is worth highlighting is if for whatever reason you experience a problem with the IRS. So, for example, you got a letter and you don't know what it means, or if you have been trying to get a hold of the IRS but you can't get a hold of them by phone, or you've sent letters and they haven't responded, um, you can get help. So basically, you can file a form, and uh, there's actually a link on the Taxpayer Advocate Services website. So this is all federally funded, and it's free to anyone. Um, and it's not just for Americans abroad, it's any US citizen, dual citizen, green card holder, any, or even a non-US citizen with a US tax filing obligation. It doesn't matter what your income level is either. If you have a problem with the IRS and you need help, you can request that they open up a case for you, and then you will be assigned a case advocate, and then they will work with you in order to resolve the outstanding problem that you face with the IRS. So they have two different offices that are divided up based on where you are in the world. Puerto Rico covers the majority of the world, and then Hawaii covers like Asia, the Middle East, or Russia. So if you want to take advantage or need to open a case, you can through most people will be through Puerto Rico. You fill in what's called Form 911. It's just one page, and it's basically your initial request for assistance. You can then email it to them or fax it to them. It does typically, it used to take 2 weeks. I would say, given how much unfortunately, the IRS workforce has been decimated in the last year. That includes funding that's been stripped from the Taxpayer Advocate Service. They have less people, so it is taking over a month for them to make initial contact from your assigned case advocate, but they will get back to you. Um, and then if you're in like Asia Pacific, uh, you can open a case through the Hawaii office, and there's their email that you can send your Form 911, and they will assign you a case advocate to help you resolve the issue. Again, these are all free services. So if you want to know more, there's links to their website. Okay, your consumer rights. We're going to get into it. So I think a lot of people really struggle in terms of trying to figure out how to file. So there's three different ways to file. It's really simple. You can file yourself, which often I think people associate with printing out the forms, filling in the boxes, reading the instructions. You can use online tax prep software, or outsource it to somebody else by getting an accountant or a tax preparer. Obviously, there is uh, if you it's more spent you will spend more time if you file yourself, but you will spend less money, aka zero money. Whereas if you hire an accountant, I say you're going to spend moderately less time compared to spending more money to outsource it to them. Because bear in mind that when you hire an accountant, they're basically going to ask you for information, and then they're going to, you have to give them the information for them to then put it into the right box on the right form. So you can save yourself money by filing yourself or using online tax prep software so that you're the one putting in the box, putting in the number in the box. So those are the options. So I've just gone through these. But the number one way that people file from abroad is using online tax prep software. It's really super helpful in terms of guiding you through the different they normally have some sort of online wizard where it asks you a series of questions and then it populates the information into the correct boxes on the correct forms for you, so you don't have to worry about which forms and such. So that tends to be the number one way that people file from abroad. So, how to file yourself. We talked a little bit about this, but basically read the instructions and download the forms from irs.gov. And I see often in like Reddit or Facebook groups, these could be great sources to ask crowdsource questions. Just be aware that it's not always going to be professionals or accurate if you're getting information from the internet. You can use the free online tax prep software that we talked about. So OLT.com and Free File Fillable Forms are online tax prep software options without instructions or minimal instructions that will let you e-file for free. Just beware that a lot of them do require a US phone number to e-file, which is an unfortunate restriction. If you have a small budget, you can use one of the cheaper paid for online tax prep software options, um, where basically you do the filing and then um, ask, and then you can actually like you can do the self prep option, and then some of them have like an upgrade option where you can upgrade to have like a human check it over for you. Um, those tend to charge less than the types of cases where you go direct to an accountant and they do it all for you. Um, so it's more like they're checking over your homework for you in a way. So some w options where there's some cost slash medium effort. Again, online tax prep software options will walk you through step by step answering all of the questions. It's best to use tax prep software. I mean, it depends on who you are. Again, if you use specialized expat tax software, um, then it will cost a little bit more compared to the stateside tax prep software options, for example, like Tax Act or OLT. Most of the tax prep software recommended on the IRS website doesn't support expats, which is very frustrating. However, I have seen minor improvements over the years, so they are getting better, but it's still not quite there. Um, we get this a lot. Um, Probably the top question that we get within the taxation task force is, can you recommend an accountant? And we cannot do that. But what we can do is recommend who not to use, and you should not use TurboTax or H&R Block. And I know that they're the top names, and I know that the like they're one of the top um, online tax prep or tax prep companies. However, they spend millions lobbying Congress to keep taxes complicated. Don't feed the machine. Don't feed something that's working against your interests. There are so many other better and and cheaper options out there in the market. And then there's the expat tax specific um, prep online software options. So those two are Expat File and My Expat Taxes. And then there's a discount link there if you want to try that one out. Mhm. Ooh. Okay, so higher costs, but lesser effort is how to find an accountant. So again, I know this is where a lot of people really struggle. And we often will get emails from people saying, "Hi, can you recommend a tax lawyer? I need to prepare my tax return." Actually, if you're preparing a tax return, you don't need a lawyer or an attorney unless you have a really, really, really complicated situation or you need tax legal advice, like the IRS came back and they said, oh, you all owe all this money when you know that you don't, or oh, you owe this penalty or this fine or something. You don't need a tax attorney or a lawyer. You can actually use an enrolled agent. So this is the highest credential awarded from the IRS, where they pass a series of exams, and it's the only one that's awarded directly from the IRS. And the kind of next level one is called a certified public accountant or a CPA. They have a much wider repertoire than an enrolled agent. Many of them went to college or university in accounting, and they can also assist with like financial planning or auditing or tax consultants. But people can be CPAs and enrolled agents, or they can be one or the other. There's combinations of credentials all over the place. Do remember that if you go for somebody who's dual qualified, so for example, someone who is qualified to file returns for your country of residence as well as the United States, they are going to be very expensive because they went to school twice. They paid for school twice. They should be paid more. Um, if you go with an online firm versus someone who has a physical office that they have to pay for, an online firm is going to be cheaper because they don't have overheads to pay for an office, you know. Um, if you can also potentially go with a tax preparer who's based in the US versus there are many that are outside of the US as well. And but one caveat with that is that a lot of US based tax preparers don't aren't specialists in international tax or expat tax. So do be careful when you're selecting a stateside accountant. Bigger firms are going to charge more than self-employed accountants. Um, I've seen some of the bigger firms charge thousands of dollars and for very simple returns. And that's just their base charge. So a lot of the time you can save yourself money by going with somebody who's self-employed, like one-man bands kind of like firms. Um, Prices, unfortunately, vary wildly. There is no price comparison website for expat accountants. You and my kind of final tip here is you need to figure out what your budget is, and then you need to stick to it. And it might take some hunting, but if you really are lacking confidence in being able to use online tax prep software, which is going to keep your costs drastically down, and you really want to use a person, you're going to pay more. That said, do not spend more than you can afford. I cannot tell you how many people I've heard from who have said they have spent a whole month's salary on paying a tax preparer to file their tax return to prove that they owe no US tax. You should not be spending outside of your means out of fear. It's it does not work for anybody. So there are options that are available. You now know a lot of them. So take advantage of those to save yourself money. So how to find an accountant continued, word of mouth. Don't be afraid to ask for references whenever you do speak with someone. You can look at online reviews. And then there's lots of country-specific American Abroad Facebook groups are great to get references or recommendations of good accountants. I just, on a high level, wanted to talk about why is it so hard to find a reasonably priced accountant? So there's a combination of factors. Um, there's a skill shortage. And I'm not just talking about outside of the United States. I'm talking about in the United States, there is a huge problem. There are not enough people going to college or university to study accounting. There's a huge, huge gap. They're really, really struggling to get people to want to learn accounting and become accountants. So if anybody has kids here, great profession to go into. Um, on top of that, a lot of them are retiring, especially for those abroad. We saw a number of people, especially after the 2017 the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that was the big tax bill that Trump passed in his first term. Um, it made the tax code so incredibly complicated, it put people off from wanting to even be in the profession. So fewer people are staying in the profession. A lot of them are retiring and going away. That's making options less available in the market as well. And many are really overwhelmed with demand, so they can pick and choose their clients. I see a lot of accountants who come to existing clients at the beginning of the year and say, "Hey, we're raising our rates." I've already gotten a number of emails from people saying, "Hey, my accountant wants to raise the fee. I can't afford it. Can you recommend somebody?" Unfortunately not, but I mean, it is a tactic that they can get away with because they can charge more money for less people and deal with less stress, you know. Um, and combining all those factors together, that's why they can charge basically whatever they want. So on the whole, I really want to remind people here that accountants are humans too. I've heard like they get really abused to a certain extent. Like you need to understand that they're overwhelmed with demand more often than not. Um, they get super busy around tax filing season. So for around the April and June filing deadlines, and then also for the October extension too. Um, they're working insane number of hours because they're just so high in demand. So just respect them. Um, and they're most busy right before a tax deadline. So don't contact somebody on April 15th saying, "Hey, can you do my tax return?" They're not going to reply to you. Um, and they also have no obligation to take you on as a client. Um, some are high in demand and they can afford to be picky. But I mean, if you call around, like a lot of people will give you like 15 to 20 minutes free on the phone just to kind of try them out. So it's worth calling around and speaking to different people. So, more tips to find an accountant. Decide on your budget and stick with it. Figure out what you need. So, what forms do you need to prepare? What's the minimum level of customer service you're okay with? Because a lot of them don't provide a great level of customer service, again, because they're so overwhelmed. Um, Speak to at least three different tax professionals before you decide who to go with. And you can ask for references. Um, do double check their qualifications. Do not use somebody who is not qualified. And you can also check on the professional, whatever their professional accreditation or, whatever qualification is on the website to make sure that they're legit as well. Um, Reasons to hire a tax professional. Don't hire somebody if you can't afford it. You should only be using someone if you can afford it, if it's in your budget. Um, Really great reason if you've had a change in circumstances or an event triggering a tax reporting requirement. So if you've moved abroad, if you've had inherited money, if you've started a business, lots of these are good reasons to hire a tax professional. And if you have a particularly complicated tax filing situation, like if you have a trust or a business or complicated investments or live in a country without a tax treaty, um, these are all good reasons to have hire a tax professional. Reasons not to hire a tax professional include, again, they're not audit insurance. They're not an insurance policy to protect you. You are responsible for what is filed on the tax return. Um, you cannot pay the problem away. It doesn't matter how expensive they are. Um, I've heard from people who have spent insane amount of money on the tax prep fees and they ended up getting hit with some sort of a fine. And it was the fault of the tax preparer, but again, because it's your tax return on your the tax return has your name on it, it's your problem. Um, I know a lot of people think paying more means you'll get a better advice or better service. That's not always necessarily the case, and paying for services someone is not qualified to advise on. So, for example, if you need investment advice, so how to invest, you're not going to go to an accountant to do that. An accountant will be able to advise on if you invested, how much you're going to get taxed on that stock or that bond or that thing that you bought or sold. That they can tell you that, but they're not going to tell you how to invest. So you need to make sure that the advice that you're seeking matches the qualifications of the individual that you're speaking to. So, next steps. How do you get started here? So if you want to do it yourself, you can go ahead and start reading the instructions on irs.gov. You can also read more about online tax prep software options, giving you the link. If you want to use an accountant, I do recommend reading. I wrote two-part blog. One is on saving money, and one is on saving, learning more about the different types of tax professionals. Um, if you haven't filed for a while or you've fallen behind, you can look at using the streamlined filing procedure. There again, we're hosting a webinar specifically on that on March 4th. And what's involved with that is that you just filed the last 3 years of tax returns and the last 6 years of FBARs. Where again, oh, sorry, I didn't update that. We're hosting the FBAR webinar. It's actually the last Wednesday of February. So I'll get that fixed. But these are all options for getting caught up. And I just want to end on saying I know that a lot of this is really scary, but I hope that was helpful and that you can do this. It's not as hard as people say it is. And I think a lot of it is built up fear in your mind. So you can do this. Lots of people do it. It's possible. Okay, so we should have the Q&A box enabled now. So Joel, if you want to do that, uh, let's see. Yep, everybody should be able to submit questions now. Oh, I see some coming in already. Okay, so I'm just going to take a few minutes to do our Democrats Abroad public service announcement, and then we'll get into the Q&A. So again, the best way to submit your questions is by typing it into the chat box, and um, any questions that you like, give it a thumbs up, and we're going to go through the questions top to bottom based on the ones that are most liked. We will not be able to get through all of the questions, but I will do my best to try to get through as many as I can. So I'm going to let you guys go ahead and submit those while I talk about our tax advocacy work. So Democrats Abroad advocates for a switch to residency-based taxation, relief for Americans abroad from FATCA, and exemption for American business owners living abroad from the GILTI and transition tax. You can read a whole lot more information about our tax advocacy work on our tax blog. And just so that you guys know a little bit more about what we do. So we're a group of volunteers specifically working on our tax advocacy work for Americans abroad. We wrote the Tax and Financial Access for Americans Abroad report, which you can read on our website. We help host tax and financial education events all over the world, like this one. We also submit statements for the congressional record for hearings and regulations. We do candidate outreach and education, and we also actually go physically to Washington, D.C. to talk to Congress. And then here's a link to the report that came out in 2022. If you have not read it, I really, really recommend that you do. It's a good summary of all the different problems, systemic problems that we face and the kind of legislative changes that we would like to see. And a lot of people I hear from say that they really felt a lot less alone after reading it. So please do go and read it if you haven't. Um, some of the top work that we do is on advocating for residence-based taxation. And there was a bill that was introduced about a year ago, which is likely to be reintroduced this year on helping Americans abroad. Basically, it would mean that you would no longer have to file a tax return with the IRS to prove that you owe no U.S. tax. You would still be liable for U.S. tax, but not having to file if you have no U.S. tax. So there's a quick explainer on the website as well as a bunch of different resources if you'd like to learn more about our advocacy work on that bill. You can also join us for one of our global tax webinars. So this is the first webinar in the series. We have 7 more coming up, and there's the list so that you can click on the link and join us for any of these other future webinars. 2 of them are free, the others are paid for and vary in price depending on, and there's a discount available for retirees and such. There are also country-specific tax webinars that are coming up. So we have one, the soonest one is for people in South Africa, followed by people in Turkey. Canada has one coming up in February, and then in March and April, Switzerland is on it. They got like 5 webinars coming up later in the year. So if you want more information that specifically covers more of the cross-border issues with your country of residence, these are the webinars to get more down and dirty in the kind of specifics for your country. So I would be remiss if I didn't mention that this is a critical election year. So the whole reason that we have lots of tax problems is because not enough people vote from abroad. Americans abroad also have the right to vote, and everybody here should exercise your right to vote, especially this year. It is so important that every single person votes from abroad because when you vote from abroad, those statistics, that's the only time that anybody from, sorry, I'm getting distracted by all of the hearts. So, um, with, we don't actually know how many Americans abroad exist. That said, every single time we vote, all of those votes are counted, and that's one of the few times that we have hard numbers on how many people live abroad. And so it is really critical and helpful for you to vote from abroad so that we have those statistics. So when the taxation task force goes to Washington, D.C., we walk into every meeting and we say, did you know that X number of people voted in your district? More often than not, they are surprised. They don't even know that we exist a lot of the time. So please, please, please register to vote. You can go to votefromabroad.org and register to vote today. Um, and also you can email voterhelp at votefromabroad.org for assistance. These are some actions that you can take. Again, I'm going to be sending out the slides. I'm just conscious of time, so I'm going to go ahead and get into the questions here as much as I can. So let's see. Okay, so and don't forget to keep liking those questions so because I'll refresh it so that we know which ones um are most wanted. Do I need state taxes as well as federal taxes? So it depends on your state of residence where you last lived and what their definition of a resident is. So you will need to go and look up the state uh tax agency and their criteria for needing to file. I know that that's really vague, but it is very state dependent. Some states are known as sticky states, so it means it's very hard to prove that you're not a state resident, even if you've lived abroad for a long time. Other states don't have any state taxes. So, for example, Florida and Texas, they don't have any state taxes, so there's no state tax return. Um, so it really does vary. You need to go off of based off of the last state that you lived in and what their residency rules are. Okay. Okay. Do you need to file for state income tax even if you've not made any money in a state in the tax year? Like for retired people living off investments, for example. And are there special rules for people whose only state income is rental income? So again, here you will need to go and look up the rules for the state. More often than not, if people have like a property that they're renting out, you will have to file a state tax return because you will likely be liable for state tax on your rental income there. Um, but again, it depends on the rules around the source of income. Um, you will need to look that up. Sorry, it's not more specific, but it is very state dependent. Um, when calculating gross income, do you apply the average exchange rate over the course of the year or the exchange rate that applies at time of filing or something else? I may be quite close to that 89,000 gross threshold. Oh, good question. I'll be honest, I don't know off the top of my head. Um, I am, yeah, I'm really sorry. I don't know. Um, I believe that there are different ways of calculating it, but don't quote me on that. I think that's an easy one that you can probably find the answer to online, though. Um, okay, next question. What is FBAR? Okay. So I see some people have answered. So the FBAR stands for the Foreign Bank Account Report, and basically it is filed separately from your tax return. A lot of people aren't aware of it, even though it's been a filing requirement since 1970. It's become more of an issue for people in recent years because a lot of court cases have been coming up where somebody was found that they didn't file the FBAR and it can come with really steep penalties. Um, so you basically report any non-US accounts which have an aggregate amount of over $10,000 at any one point in the year. So, for example, it doesn't matter if it's the same income. If you have two accounts and you transfer $5,000 or the equivalent of to another account, um, then that then triggers the $10,000 threshold and the filing requirement. Um, Even if, for example, you are a student studying abroad, and one day you transfer money over to pay your tuition and you are over $10,000, that also triggers the filing requirement. And the form is filed with what's called the Financial Crimes Network, not with the IRS. And I know a lot of people feel like they're being treated like a criminal. Um, and I agree. It is a ridiculously low filing threshold and something that Democrats abroad has advocated for in terms of reform. It really should, it's overdue for reform. Um, in lots of different ways. So I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but if you have any non-US accounts and you exceed the $10,000 aggregate filing threshold, then you are required to file it with the Financial Crimes Network. Again, we have a webinar on that um, at the end of February, which you're welcome to sign up for too. Okay, next question. Which do you recommend more, Expat File or My Expat Taxes for those of us willing to pay and do the work ourselves? It's really personal preference. I mean, you don't have to pay initially. You can go in and just play around with it and see which one you like better, honestly. What is the status of the congressional bill to change the tax filing laws for expats? So I mentioned it earlier. Basically, we're waiting for it to be reintroduced. We don't know when that's going to be, but we're hopeful that it will be sooner rather than later. And you will definitely hear about it when it does happen. So I would recommend that you sign up for the Taxation Task Force mailing list, which is different from the main Democrats Abroad mailing list. I think a lot of people don't realize there's like lots of Democrats Abroad mailing lists. When you first join and sign up on the website, you're added to the global mailing list and your country mailing list, so you get the country specific stuff. But you can also sign up for the Taxation Task Force mailing list, which is separate. And we would notify you first about any changes or updates on that bill. Can you go through the most popular forms that need to be submitted? So it was on, where was that slide? I go back. I can leave it up. Do. Sorry, lots of slides. Do. There we go. These are the most common slides. I'll leave that up so that you can look at that there. Okay. How afraid should we be of the IRS having new AI agents this year? AI agents. Sorry, maybe I missed something here. Uh, if you could provide more information there, I haven't heard of AI agents. I mean, I can talk more broadly because last year, basically, I think a lot of people, we got a lot of emails at one point about asking us about Doge, and how they were accessing taxpayer data. Um, what happened was a lot of people were laid off from the IRS. They lost a third of their workforce. So in all honesty, the IRS is it was already pretty dysfunctional and it's even more so. So I think a lot of people think of the IRS as this like boogeyman that's going to come after them. I'm not saying that there aren't auditing agents or um, agents that do exist, but the ones that specialize in international, which is for people living overseas, is severely limited because they require a, a really healthy understanding of these complex forms, right? In order to do the audit. Um, there are not that many of them left. I don't know the numbers, they don't share that information, but there's not as many as there were in the past. Um, unless you have something to hide. I think like I get this question. I'm like, well, if you're paranoid about them coming after you, what have you done wrong? Like if you haven't done anything wrong, then it's highly unlikely someone is going to come after you. If you're filing and you're doing your best effort, that is all you can do, right? I mean, that's as simple as it is. Also keep in mind that if they are going to come after you for an audit, they're only going to go after people who are worth the effort. So if they audit and they find you owed like another $5 or $10, that they're not even going to bother with an audit in that. They're going after people with more money or potentially owe more tax. So like that's when you should be a little bit more wary about your that getting audited. I hope that answers. Sorry, I don't know much more about it. Um, so I have never filed. It's been decades. How far back do I have to go in terms of years? So I did mention that there is a what's called the streamlined filing procedure. It's a catch-up program where they waive the penalties. And even if you haven't been filing for decades and you should have, and you didn't know, then you in the program you only back file for the last 3 years. Um, and it's 6 years for the FBAR. So it's a good program for people to come back into compliance. Okay, can you help me with a question? Last year, I turned 65 and retired. I got a small 401k distribution last year and paid a 20% tax, approximately $8,000. This was automatically deducted from Fidelity and paid to the IRS. Is there any way I can file and get all or some of this back? How, what form do I need to do this? Thank you. I'm sorry, I don't know. I'm not an accountant. I'm not a tax preparer. Sorry. Okay. Can I e-file if I need to submit old returns to be compliant? Yes. It depends on the tax prep software that you use. That will depend on how far back that particular online software will support older returns, but many of them do. You just have to find the right ones depending on how far back you need to go. Okay, income must be under 89,000 adjusted gross income for free file. Is this limit for single filers or joint filers? It's for single. Good question. I'm not sure what the joint filing amount is. It will be on the IRS's website. It's under a program called the uh, Low Income Taxpayer Clinic, um, or the Volunteer Income Taxpayer Clinic. It's VITA for short. There should be a table on there that will tell you what it is depending on your filing status. What about single head of household? Yeah, again, I don't know off the top of my head. It will be on the IRS's website though. Okay. I have an inherited IRA in the US obtained in 2025. I'm required to withdraw a certain amount every year, required minimum distribution. Do I pay tax on this in the US or in my country of tax residence or both? Ooh. Again, I don't know. However, I know a lot of people will go and look at the tax treaty for their country of residence. So a lot of countries have a tax treaty with the US. So you can go and potentially reference that. Um, Otherwise, you'll need to speak to a tax professional or you can ask in any of the online forums as well. Do say what country you live in. That will be important piece of information in order for any kind of like um, crowdsourcing of that kind of question. Okay. How to avoid double taxation. My income is modest. This year, I got hit with a $2,000 tax bill from the IRS and the threat of an audit, even though I had paid income tax in the UK. This is the first year that this has happened. I am 70 and receive US Social Security. Um, so like I mentioned, anybody can be audited. Um, I'm really sorry that this has happened to you. I know it's really super stressful. Um, there are a lot of ways to avoid double taxation. Um, like I mentioned earlier, if you need any assistance for free, you can go to the Taxpayer Advocate Service and they can open up a case on your behalf in order to help liaise with the IRS in order to help you work through that. Um, and we're also hosting a tax webinar on how to avoid double taxation, because these are common concerns and questions. So have a look at the tax webinar series, and you're welcome to sign up for that as well. I'll just read some of the other comments here that other people made, which is make sure you are using the foreign tax credit or the foreign earned income exclusion to get credit on the US tax, on the UK taxes paid. That's a good tip. Social Security is not considered earned income, so use the foreign tax credit form. Also a good tip. So thank you guys. Um, just looking at the time, we'll take a few more questions. So are foreign retirement accounts taxed in the US? Um, Again, it need more information. I'm not an accountant. I can't advise, and it will also depend on the US tax treaty for your country of residence as well. Could you tell us more about the streamlined filing procedure for those who haven't filed for several years? Uh, it is as I mentioned earlier, you even if you haven't filed for longer, what you do is you back file for the last 3 years. Um, and the last 6 years for FBARs. And you basically sign a statement saying, I'm sorry, I didn't know I was supposed to file. And then they waive the penalties. So it's a really good program in order to get caught up for anybody that didn't know that they were supposed to be filing. The whole point of that program is because the IRS recognizes that a lot of people living abroad don't file. And sorry, I don't think I mentioned this earlier, but the major if you look at the filing statistics, um, oh, good question. Can this be done online or e-file? No. The streamlined filing procedure, unfortunately, it has to be paper filed. They do not have an e-file option. Super annoying. Um, yeah, so you end up sending like a huge stack to the United States. But yeah, so one of the things to keep in mind is if you look at IRS filing statistics for Americans abroad, the latest tax filing year was for statistics was 2022, and there were about 1 million returns that were filed. But if you go off of the US State Department's estimate of 9 million Americans living abroad, that is a huge number of people who are not filing. So if you are filing, you are in the minority. If you are not filing, you're actually in the majority. So there's a fun stat there. Okay. Uh, Last question, because we're out of time now. What are the differences or advantages between filing as head of household and married filing separately? Um, so a lot, the simple answer to that is that most people who have kids, but who are married to a non-US spouse will file as head of household because you qualify for a higher deduction and things like that. Married filing separately is almost like married, like filing is single. So you get better treatment as head of household. The blog article that I wrote comparing the different filing statuses for Americans abroad is a really good reference in order to kind of figure out. You can also choose, however, uh, yeah, I think if you have dependents, that tends to be the qualifying factor for being eligible for head of household. Um, okay, we're unfortunately out of time, guys. I'm really sorry. Um, but oh, sorry, let me go to the last slide. There are all these slides. So thank you everyone for joining. I really, really appreciate it. Please, please, please don't forget to fill in the feedback form. Let us know what you thought of this webinar, what you thought was good, what you thought could be improved, etc. Please don't forget to fill that in. It's super, super important. There's our email address as well. I hope you learned something and I hope it's less scary. Um, yeah. So with that, I just want to say thank you for joining and I hope you have a good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. And we'll see you guys again soon. Oh.